On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, IMF forecast of slightly slower global growth, while the search for a new IMF chief begins. A time for reform? And a resurgent Ebola quickly spreading in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. What's undermining the response? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. We begin with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. They released the latest World Economic Outlook on Tuesday, which said global growth remains subdued and precarious. Meanwhile, the organization itself is facing uncertainties. The current managing director, Christine Lagarde, has announced her resignation. She will become president of the European Central Bank in November. So with Ms. Lagarde heading to Paris, who will be the next IMF chief? Before we try to figure that out with our panelists, let's take a look at this.
Who will be the next IMF chief? On Tuesday, Christine Lagarde, the outgoing managing director of the International Monetary Fund, said she would officially step down on September 12. This first female leader of the IMF is said to be the first woman to lead the ECB, the European Central Bank. She announced her resignation last week, and the selection process started. According to the IMF's Articles of Agreement, the managing director shall be chief of the operating staff of the fund and shall conduct, under the direction of the executive board, the ordinary business of the fund. The organization has had 11 managing directors since it began operations in 1945. In its 74-year history, the fund has always been run by a European, a tradition, a job no one from outside the continent held. There is no official shortlist of candidates, but many European governments have put forward names to take the top job. Some of them are Nadia Calvino, the Spanish finance minister; Mario Centeno, the Portuguese finance minister and currently Eurogroup chief; Jeroen Dijsselbloem, a former Dutch finance minister; Olli Rehn, the Bank of Finland governor; Mark Carney, governor of the Bank of England; Kristalina Georgieva, the chief executive of the World Bank from Bulgaria. While European countries are struggling to rally behind one name, the IMF published the latest World Economic Outlook. Compared to the April projection, the IMF cut the global forecast by 0.1 percentage point for this year and next, with growth expected to hit 3.2% in 2019 and 3.5% in 2020. The IMF said the revision is mainly attributed to combined factors of ongoing trade tariffs and Brexit uncertainties that have weakened investment and disrupted the supply chain. Faced with uncertainties, both inside and outside, how should the IMF go forward?
For more on the race of IMF new chief, let's loop in our panelists. In New York, Anthony Chen, former chief economist of the J.P. Morgan Chase. In Brussels, Daniel Groh, director of the Center for European Policy Studies. Last but not least, Liu Baocheng, dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics in China. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Who will be the next chief of the IMF? That's, of course, the question, but the most important question really is, what about the qualities that individual must have? To you, Mr. Chen, what would you say?
I think that the qualities certainly have to sort of be multifaceted. I think they got to have good political skills. They got to have solid economics background. But right now, it appears that that position now is moving more in the direction of having great political skills and maybe not as great economic skills. Because again, the IMF has an excellent staff, so that any shortfalls on the economic front certainly can be made up by the staff. As you said earlier, historically it has been a European. There's no shortage of candidates in that area, so I'm very confident that they will pick a qualified person for the position.
More a polity expert or more of an economics expert, Mr. Guo? What do you think?
I think the expertise in economy and finance, especially global finance, should really be very important, because the IMF has, of course, an excellent staff, but very often the staff comes with 2 or 3 different opinions and options. And the head then has to come down on one line. And that, I think, requires very sound judgment on the economy, but also the financial aspects of the global economy. And that, I think, should be one key qualification for this job.
But if you look at it, Mr. Guo, Ms. Lagarde is certainly not an expert in economics, but certainly a great advocate for IMF. So what do you think the next one that's likely to come in the office where she is in right now will have similar qualities or very different in the other direction, Mr. Guo?
I think de facto it will probably be somebody with political skills, somebody who can bring the finance ministers together, achieve some consensus at the global stage, and otherwise rely on the machinery. But I don't think that is necessarily a good choice.
Professor Liu, what do you think? Now, with more participation of the G20 economies, how well connected and inclusive this new chief has to be in terms of his or her role in the international economic system?
Yeah, conventionally she has to deal with all the finance ministers who are very proud, and therefore you have to show a very strong expertise in finance. But in the meantime, in the current global context, to be able to leverage this global financial institution towards something that is really serve the renewed mission of IMF, really to bring financial stability and weaving a more interconnected financial market that requires very demanding skills. And the other is that when also the new emerging phenomenon like digital economies, be it Libra, be it Bitcoin, etc., they also have to have a strong learning capacity so that they are able to cope with the new developments.
I'm afraid all of you gentlemen are asking for a miraculous personality to arise in the world so that to be the chief of the IMF. But let me be more specific on some of the qualities. First of all, it has traditionally been, Mr. Chen, European. Now, will that change? Should that change? If that changes, is it for the better or for the worse?
Well, I think that when you have a more diverse pool to choose from, that's always very positive. But you can't ignore tradition. And by the way, I don't disagree with all the other panelists. I would love to see a person that has a good grasp of economics and finance. I have a PhD in economics, so of course I'm going to be cheering for someone with a solid economic background. But I have to be pragmatic. The pragmatic part of me says that the positions are moving more and more in the direction of having stronger rather than weaker or outsized political skills. And I think it'll move in that direction. And by the way, there are many qualified candidates out there that are not European. Of course, the former head of the Reserve Bank of India, Rahan, an excellent candidate for that position. But again, that tradition that a European fills this job and then an American fills the top job at the World Bank. Very hard to break with that tradition.
Why is it hard?
But again, I have no issues whatsoever if they decide to go otherwise.
Why is it hard to break away from the tradition? Why is it hard to break away from the tradition, you think?
Well, it's hard because it's sort of been informal. and it's been like that for a while. And if you break with the tradition and you bring in a non-European, does that mean that in the World Bank you also have to break with the tradition and no longer bring in an American candidate? So breaking one tradition requires the breaking of the other tradition in the World Bank. So again, the path of least resistance is to continue with the tradition. Doesn't mean that it has to, but it's the path of least resistance.
So shall we go with the continuity, meaning equals to almost the stability, or shall we go with an abrupt change, which might bring some kinds of a different approach toward the IMF, since we're also talking about the international organizations reform, for better or for worse? What do you think, Mr. Groh?
My view would be that we should break this tradition.
Oh, you're coming from the European continent, and you're saying, let's break with the tradition.
I'm, of course, not expressing here the opinion of Brussels, of European governments. But seriously, the tradition that the head of the IMF was a European was based on the fact that the Europeans contributed most to the IMF financially, and ultimately also that they had been a very source of trouble for the IMF. Now, hopefully these things is no longer the case in the future. The Eurozone is stable now, and the rest of the world is becoming more important. I think traditions have to adapt when the environment adapts. And therefore, it would be very useful, perhaps, if the next head of the IMF doesn't have too much of a European baggage, but thinks really globally, and maybe such a person can be easier found outside Europe.
Professor Liu, is Mr. Groh too much an idealistic person, at least on this issue? Is he too optimistic about so-called the other choice?
Well, I really concur with him because right now
we're having a very revolutionary panel.
The landscape of global economic and financial order is really evolving a great deal, particularly for the emergence of the big economies.
That we all know, but the thing is whether we should change the places where the chief of the IMF originally coming from, which has been the tradition since the establishment of Bretton Woods system.
Yeah, this is really an unwritten rule. Now that it is unwritten, therefore, there has to be some formula to be considered in an alternative way, because, for example, if the voting power is really dependent on the size of the economy, and now, China obviously now taking 6%.
But did you hear what also Mr. Chan had just said, that if you change one, there might be chain reactions in all the other international organizations, and it's likely that you are not just facing one issue of changing the head of the IMF, but rather an overall change of the mechanism and system. Is the world ready for that right now?
Well, at least, there should be included more of the candidacies from the developing world, so that people can really make a decision based on the original charter, article of association, etc. But on the onset, to simply select the big majority of Europeans on the candidate list is really something that can be reconsidered.
Okay, interesting. Mr. Chan, anything to debate against your two other colleagues?
Well, again, I think we're all not far from disagreeing with each other. I think we're mostly in agreement. I think in the best of all possible worlds,
it sounds like you have a very big disagreement,
open
sir. I'm
structure.
afraid, if I could be frank, they're saying let's have somebody else. You're saying let's go with the Europeans.
No, not at all, because I said a little while ago that I'm very happy with having a person that has an economics background, and I said very clearly that there are many qualified candidates out there. I mentioned the head of the Reserve Bank of India as being very well qualified. What I did say was that if you break this tradition, you really have to, it's a chain reaction, as you articulated, and you have to be prepared to break with the other traditions. The path of least resistance is still to keep the status quo, but I think that if you decide to break and you start to really look at all the candidates, I think we'll probably be better off. However, I think that that is a bit much break so abruptly. And I think that was probably something that's going to happen over time, but not necessarily this time around.
Well, the chief of the IMF is only one issue, but even more importantly, that is what will be the role of the IMF. Mr. Guo, putting the earlier debate about who exactly should be sitting in that chair to the members of the IMF eventually to vote on, but the nature of IMF, should people think further about that? Think about 1970s when the US dollar's peg to the gold was not necessarily going to be the only way how the international finance system is going to was run, to the 2008 the international financial crisis, and now to now you see uncertainties going on, and on the IMF played a certain role. But the question now, Mr. Guo, seriously, is whether the IMF is still capable of managing uncertainties, as we're seeing more and more of them right now.
The IMF has remained and remains relevant. Of course, there are these standard tasks which the IMF has to fulfill. Think about countries which need a program, like Argentina today and maybe somebody else tomorrow. And that is, I think, a role which the IMF feels very comfortable to fulfill. And then there are more difficult issues, like the global current account disequilibria. There used to be between the United States and China. Now they're between the euro area and the US. What position should the IMF take? What recommendations should it make? Who should adjust? Should one see that there are currency manipulations? All of these things become more and more important as the global economy and finance integrates. And I think the IMF has to offer a lot: advice, research, insights, and that's what it can bring to the table. And the ultimate decisions, of course, remain mostly with the finance ministers of the G20. But to have one body behind them who looks at the global economy, that is very useful.
Professor Chen, though, there have been debates about who should be playing a bigger role in terms of IMF decisions. Mr. Guo earlier mentioned about G20. We see a pattern earlier of G7, for example, and then there was so-called G12 even. Some mentioned that word, and now G20, of course. But the question really is, as the economy evolves, what should be the roles of the economies, as we say, in terms of making the right decision for the IMF, as even among the G20, there are very, very, very different opinions?
Well, I think there's no question that the IMF will be giving recommendations to really ease trade tensions. But there's no secret that there's been a rise in popularism, not only in the United States, but also in Europe and to some extent in other parts of the world. So this makes it a lot more challenging for these countries to get along. And in fact, the IMF estimates that when you look at the volume of trade over the last 12 months, it actually has come down, and even their projections moving forward is still quite challenging. So it's one thing to say that the IMF remains relevant, and another thing to say whether they really have influence. I think that right now, with many of these countries really trying to really voice more protectionism, that the influence of the IMF has, to some extent, waned a bit and become less powerful. Yes, they will continue to make recommendations, and maybe the right recommendations, but it's not clear to me that all the countries are listening. When I look at Europe, there's trade tensions between Europe and the United States. When I look at China, there's trade tensions between China and the United States. When I look at Japan, there's trade tensions between Japan and South Korea. So again, these are all big challenges for the IMF.
States as well.
And I don't expect the IMF to use a magic wand and make them go away.
Yes. If you look at the latest report, even just published earlier this week, Professor Liu, 0.1% likely to be the caution that the IMF is suggesting about the global economy. So what does they say, once again, about the qualities of the IMF and the power of IMF, credibility of IMF with the other capitals to be able to work with the suggestion and advice provided by the IMF?
Well, in the first place, they provide really timely and quality
Sure.
reports that can really offer a precursor of where the economy is really heading for the entire globe. And also they provide the, of course, the funding, for, this is really the major mission for financial stability. But the issue is that whether they are more tilted to be, because some critics would say, okay, they are more tilted to be more of the spoils of the Europeans, and they are getting too much more intertangled with the, sovereign debt issues and also oversighting or ignoring some of the severe problems in those emerging economies and underdeveloped economies. So that's something that the world is really raising concern. And the other is that, when the world is now risking fragmentation and challenge to all global institutions, be it WTO, be it IMF,
right.
How can they really maintain the right fabric and dynamism as a global institution, given its also limited financing capacity? So that's quite a challenge, and that's why it's very demanding for the qualification of the new one that filled the IMF director chair.
Mr. Guo, there were earlier attempts to reform. When it comes to policies, for example, IMF have been talking about, what about the currency swap experiments that can be done among members of the IMF? There's also been, the Belt and Road Initiative. How is IMF likely to work with these kind of regional and beyond the regional mechanisms? Also, what about the new possibilities, new financial possibilities about the Bitcoins and some of the others, like the Libra recently popped up? So what about the IMF's renewable, how should I say, maybe capacity to renew itself in terms of embracing new possibilities, and also be critical at the same time to make sure it is still a very reliable source for judgment?
Well, the IMF has a very high-quality staff, and it has the capacity to adapt. It can look at new challenges like the cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin, and so on. So far, these have remained really at the margins of finance. They don't really seem to pose a particular issue. More critical, more important were all these regional issues that you mentioned, the Belt and Road, the Shanghai Initiative, regional
currency swap,
swap lines between central banks. They have a certain importance, but what has emerged is that these issues, these mechanisms remain regional. If there's one institution which really looks out for the global economy and global financial stability, it remains the IMF. These regional ones can help, and sometimes they can help if there's a particular regional problem, but we still need the IMF when it comes down to the global financial system.
Mr. Chen, final words also?
Well, I think that moving forward, the IMF is going to have to start thinking outside the box, because the world is clearly changing. The world is becoming more polarized in some sense, and I think that it's not a situation where the IMF will be looking at all the countries and giving its best advice on what to do, because right now many of these countries have their own individual ideas of the best way to move forward, and those views are not necessarily in the best interest of the global economy. And I've always believed that the IMF has always had the best interest of the global economy, and right now I think we have too many individual interests of the different countries, and they don't always coincide with what's best for the entire global economy, which is the goal of the IMF to pursue.
Anthony Chen, Liu Baocheng, Daniel Guo, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Really appreciate it. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our live program. A resurgent Ebola quickly spreading in the Democratic Republic of Congo and beyond. What's undermining the response? Some answers right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The World Health Organization has declared Ebola outbreak an emergency of global concern. The Democratic Republic of Congo is trying to contain viral infections that have already killed more than 1,700 people. The DRC health minister resigned on Monday in protest of the DRC president's announcement last week that he would take control of the response to the Ebola. Before we get down to a discussion, let's take a look at this.
Ebola is back. Ebola is a rare and deadly disease in people and non-human primates. Its main symptoms are fever, diarrhea, and unexplained hemorrhage. The second largest outbreak was in August in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, infecting 2,500 people. Two-thirds of them died. About 12 new cases are being reported every day. Last week, the World Health Organization declared the outbreak a global health emergency. Despite raising the threat level, Johnny Kangasong, the director of the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, remains optimistic.
The current disease outbreak in Democratic Republic of Congo is the second largest Ebola outbreak in the history of Ebola. Interestingly, about 700 confirmed cases have been cured. So this is very good news. So it means Ebola is not a death sentence, that we still have chances of surviving.
The disease is spreading very fast. Neighboring countries are closing their borders. This is worrying DRC citizens.
Countries bordering the DRC should not close their borders to DRC citizens, because if they do so, it will have a very negative impact on our economy.
Many of our people survive on trading with neighboring countries. If those countries close their borders, it will be a disaster.
According to the World Health Organization, a new vaccine has been used for containment. It is 97% effective, and more than 161,000 people have been given it. But everybody is not vaccinated, only those who come into direct contact with an Ebola patient and people who come into contact with them. The response to the latest outbreak has been complicated by sporadic attacks on health workers and conspiracy theories about the current vaccine.
So what's undermining the efforts to contain Ebola this time around? Let's loop in our panelists. In Nairobi, we have invited Peterson Wachira, who is the team leader and spokesperson of the Ebola Warriors Kenya. In Washington, D.C., Eric Ding, an epidemiologist and certainly health economist from the Harvard School of Public Health. In our Beijing studio, we have Shi Yi of the Institute of Microbiology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. I want to go to you first, Mr. Wachira, about your experiences. You were among the 155 health workers from Kenya who left for Sierra Leone and Liberia in 2014 as part of a 6-month African Union mission to fight the Ebola outbreak over there. So why are we having a second largest outbreak this time? Haven't we learned the lessons from your perspective?
Okay, thank you, and thank you for having me. I think for DRC Congo, this is not the first outbreak that we are having. And in fact, one of the type of Ebola that we are having right now that is causing the outbreak, the place where it was found for the very first time is still in Congo, and that is why it's called Zaire Ebola virus. The reason, you're asking the reason as to why we are having a second outbreak, even having been able to manage the first one. And if you look at DRC Congo, the health systems are not up to where we expect them to be. And so when you do not have very good health systems, and that means that even the health workers themselves sometimes are getting infected. Like now we have 140 of them who have actually already been infected, and most have succumbed to the same. Then it becomes a problem.
But Mr. Vatira, when you were serving as part of the team to cure and prevent the outbreak of Ebola last time, 2014, what were some of the biggest issues as a health worker you have to pay attention to? What do you think could be the advice you can extend to your colleagues right now trying to fight the second largest outbreak ever in history?
When it comes to managing Ebola, there are a set of approaches that you must be able to take for you to be able to manage the outbreak. And unfortunately for Ebola is that most of the time there is a lot of stigma, and there are some customs and traditions that are attached to it, and some of the customs actually aid in the same transmission. Like when we were there, the reason as to why we were able to manage the outbreak is first of all because there was a strong political will from the government. The governance was very stable, and from there then you are able to go down to the citizens, especially in the affected regions, and you're able, using the communication strategies, to be able to do health education, so that you can be able to educate them first to identify that this is not a matter of customs or something that is beyond our understanding, like witchcraft, as we have seen in Congo. To understand that this is a condition, and that for them to be able to manage them, there will be need for them to be able to put some of their customs and traditions on hold.
All right.
So that we can be able to manage. Of course, the other aspects.
Go ahead.
Hello?
If you want to say other aspects. We understand there are traditions, but besides that?
Yeah, so the other aspect, of course, is that you must be able to have a very strong case management, where you are able to manage those who already are having infected with Ebola. Then you must have another aspect of where you have to address the episurveillance and contact tracing, so that you can be able to get everybody who has come into contact, and you're able to monitor them over the next 21 days.
Well, I guess that is probably the rule for all kinds of transmittable diseases you have just mentioned. It's a laundry list of must-do things. But for now, I want to thank you, Mr. Peterson Vatira. And I understand, Mr. Vatira, you have to go for now for your mission. Thank you so much for joining us. And now let's talk to other guests. Dr. Ding, thank you so much for waiting. Well, I'm talking to your African colleagues now. The vaccine is already there. Is the vaccine going to play a big role this time in preventing and treatment of the second largest outbreak? Briefly.
Thank you for having me here. The first Merck vaccine right now, there is a very limited quantity. There's only 250,000 doses, and it requires a very extensive sub-zero cold chain. And right now, they don't have enough for everyone. And for vaccine to work, it needs to be available for everyone. Right now, they're only using it for ring vaccination of infected people's friends, relatives, as well as aid workers. But this is not, even though the vaccine is 97% effective, you need a vaccination program for everyone. And for that, we need the other vaccine. There's the Johnson & Johnson experimental vaccine that requires 2 doses, 8 weeks apart. And those, they have 1.5 million doses ready to test, and that one they want to give to everyone over the age of 1 year old. But that one is still experimental, but there are series, there's the Merck vaccine and the Johnson & Johnson experimental vaccine that is ready to go, but it needs to be given to everyone, not just the ring vaccine around the people who are infected.
Well, now is it possible, Mr. Shi, sitting here with me, Professor Shi, is it possible that every one of them will receive a vaccine? It sounds very much too much of a luxury at this moment, isn't it?
Luxury?
The vaccines, because Dr. Ding was talking about everybody could have a vaccine, and there are different kinds of vaccines under test right now. Do you think that is possible? Everyone can have a vaccine?
I don't think so, because
I think it's Merck and it's a Johnson & Johnson company.
We don't want to mention the companies too many times. We don't want to do any advertisement for any company at this point. But my question really is, will vaccine be available to everyone?
First, I think it's short of supply for the vaccine. Second, the local people, they don't accept vaccination. So I think the distrust is a problem there. So
I see. Professor Shi, last time in 2014, when the outbreak last time was happening, Chinese medical teams were being sent over there.
Yes.
How were the issue being resolved then? And as a result, can we learn from the last experience?
Yes, I think our team came to the Sierra Leone and they make sure everybody can be tested for the Ebola virus, and they control the people in some regions and avoid them to contacting with others. So I think the separate the infected people from the uninfected people is very important. So this is the experience from the team.
How much does it take to do that, to separate the infected from those who are not? In a local place like Sierra Leone then in 2014, and now people have to think about it in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
So I think it depends, because you should test the people and ask the people to accept the tests. So if the people can ready to be tested, so I think maybe it will take half a year. Yeah.
Given that is the timeline, Dr. Ding, we are talking about, half a year, this outbreak would already become quite something, right? And now it's already the second largest in history. So is there something that can be done with emergency to prevent it from spreading around even further? Closing the border is not the way, because people argue, who's going to help us if we close the border? Dr. Ding.
Right. Right. We definitely do not want to close the border, but you have to be very vigilant, and this is why WHO declared emergency, because they're calling for assistance from countries around the world. They need immediately $26 million in the next 3 months to contain it, or else it will be way more widespread. And WHO has been bearing the brunt so far for the last few months trying to contain it. And Ebola is something that sometimes, even if you're affected, doesn't show symptoms for 9 or 10 days. And so the containment resources for anyone infected, community infected, is enormous. There's more than just vaccines. There's more vaccines on the horizon, but we need to improve the cold chains for vaccines, getting access to the vaccines, and affording all the containment and the mobilization. And yes, there's local issues, the cultural issues, but we have to mobilize, and all the countries of the world have to pitch in with this emergency and provide support immediately.
Now, here's the thing always, Dr. Ding, that who will play a pivotal role? Is it going to be international organizations like the WHO, or is it going to be international medical teams like we've witnessed some of them in 2014 in Sierra Leone, or is it local people, and particularly local medical circles and communities, going to play a much bigger role given the context of the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Right. Well, right now, Doctors Without Borders, many other NGOs, and WHO have been there for months and months already. But clearly, it's not enough. To prevent a global pandemic in which this is spreading across the globe, we need to have all the resources. Militaries have to be involved. And last time, the U.S. military actually provided a lot of the vaccine and all the containment infrastructure. Other countries need to get involved now. And other organizations like Last Mile Health that helped contain the Ebola in Liberia, we need more organizations, not just in Congo, but mobilize the world. And that is what the WHO Emergency Declaration does. We need $26 million in 3 months, as well as all the countries in the world to send resources now before it becomes everyone's problem.
And before it becomes everyone's problem, what should everybody else be doing? Professor Shi, here's the question for you. What about the other African countries? What should they do now to prevent the disease further spreading to their territories? Professor.
So actually, if we want to prevent this Ebola from one country to another country, you must make sure the people who is suspected to be infected by Ebola virus, they should be tested correctly, and we should in time make sure the people don't run from one place to another place, and make sure the infected people will not contact the other people. And also, I think the vaccine is also very important. Yeah.
Well, I guess we've been talking about some of the principles, gentlemen, but one of the most important things is to really how to implement these principles on the ground. For now, I want to thank you anyway for your input and your insights. Eric Ding and Shi Yi, really appreciate it. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and see the Weibo from Tian Wei and everyone on the World Insight team. Thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Bye for now. Thank you.